So we're going to explore the important role that nutrition plays in sport, both fueling athletes before sport and helping with recovery after training and after games. And with us is an expert in that area. She's a registered dietitian. Her name is Dr. Sharon Madigan, and she is head of performance nutrition with the Sport Ireland Institute. Sharon, how are you?
Good, how are you?
And to give you just a little bit of the level of expertise we're talking about, she has worked with elite athletes across the Olympics, across Paralympics, and she's been an adjunct professor at the University of Limerick and a clinical dietitian at the University of Limerick. So she didn't, as they say, lick it off the rocks.
I don't know about that.
Come here, if we're talking sport, there is a sense that with elite athletes, it is a world apart and everything has to be different. Is that the case, or is sports nutrition just good nutrition?
Yeah, I think it's keep it simple, and start from the basis, building blocks. And yes, there's some, adaptations that you can do at some stage, but if the basics aren't right, you're not going to be right in the full.
And what about scale? Because I hear athletes say that they have to consume 5, 6, 7,000 calories a day. And
that's the tricky bit for some, so some of our athletes, if we take, say, for example, distance running, cycling, rowing particularly, depends on how big the athlete is, but we've some of our athletes that may need up to 10,000 calories a day. Like
10,000?
That's crazy stuff.
That's probably 4 or 5 times the average male intake if it's a male athlete?
Probably. Wow. Slightly, about 4 times maybe, slightly less than that, 3.5, something like that. But yeah, if you've got somebody who's weighing 95 kilos, 100 kilos, and they're doing, maybe 4 hours, 5 hours of training a day, it's a huge ask, and that becomes a problem. So it's actually the practical issues of how do you deal with that in a training environment, but then also when they travel or when they're outside their own home environment as well.
Because I assume it's not like they can just say, I'll load up on glucose or sugar. It still has to be healthy and balanced calories that they're getting. Yeah,
well, I think I suppose number one, it's they get the calories. Number two, can they manage the volume of calories? Because if you put out 10,000 calories on a table like this, the whole table will be covered all over, So again, how do you run with that on board? How do you cycle with that on board? How do you row with that on board? So it's those practical things. And then if you're training for 5, 6, 7 hours a day, how do you get the time to do that? So there's all of those practical issues. And I think that becomes then where healthy becomes a contextual thing. So what's healthy for myself, who's sitting on a couch for 23.5 hours a day, give or take, versus those athletes that are training for significant amounts of hours every day, becomes very different.
In other words, the athletes can actually be ostensibly more unhealthy than the person.
Yeah, and again, that's a contextual thing, because what we're aiming to do is keep them injury-free and well and be able to sustain that training load. So to do that, it's highly unlikely. Let's say, for example, we might say to them at half time or during a break, you would have a tin of baked beans or something like that. It just wouldn't happen. Whereas we might have to look to something that's much more grab and go, which, wouldn't be what the message would be for general public.
And what about the phasing of when either elite athletes eat, or even people who are very much into sport? The phrase that always comes up is carb loading.
Yeah.
Do you time out the protein and carb structure of a diet like that?
Yeah, carb loading was one of those kind of phrases that came out of the 70s, 80s, and where a lot of athletes would have, passed it up to within an inch of their lives before a race. Now that brings with it its own tricky situations, runner's trots, I think you've probably heard of. But the thing about
Don't wow us with technical terms.
Where I think that has probably taken a bit of a back door is that if you can keep an athlete doing similar things, when you introduce a taper, or they kind of reduce the amount of work that they're doing in that lead up to a race or a competition, you kind of naturally get a carbohydrate load anyway. Because they will not be using as much, and those then will be in the stores, will be there in terms of muscle as well. Plus the athlete knows what that feels like, because that's one of the biggest issues, is how do you your guts have to respond to variations in, how much fiber's in something, because that can be tricky as well. So sometimes, again, we come back to that health message where whole grain and high fiber is really suitable and would be recommended for Joe Public, but actually that might not be suitable, before a race or before a competition for an athlete.
One of the sports that you deal with in an Olympic context has some of the biggest challenges in terms of nutrition, which is the boxers. Yeah. Because trying to make a weight cut before you do a weigh-in, that has to be an extraordinary challenge for an athlete.
Yeah, that is very, very difficult, because generally those athletes are not living at their weight that they're competing at is probably not their living weight. So that's the first challenge.
Sometimes by a chasm, it can be quite the drop.
Absolutely. So you find that's they struggle, and it's about making sure that they understand that they can't just jump down to that or really struggle to get down to that weight. They have to give themselves a little bit of time, and that's part of the education that we would do with athletes or boxers for a longer period of time, understanding that if you come down to weight rather than trying to sweat that off, you see the benefits in terms of how you perform over, let's say, a week at a World Championships. If you take the Olympic Games, which is really a massive push for boxing, they will compete on day one, and if they're lucky, they'll compete on the closing ceremony day. So that's 16 days potentially of competition where they have to make weight, which is very different to judo, where you'll weigh in the morning or the night before and you'll compete in one day. So the judo athlete will have their medal in the evening.
Whereas, and a cheeseburger.
Yeah, or whatever from various different places. But so again, if that boxer hasn't done that properly, they may get through the first round, they may get through the second round, but when you start to get to the medal rounds, that's where you can definitely start to see who's going to get a medal and who might not.
When we look at, and there's a lot more coverage, I suspect now, of sports nutrition than there has been in years before. Do people mistake what elite sport is actually like? Because you hear an awful lot of people talking about, well, I went to the gym today, so I have to eat X, or I need to take Y supplement.
Yeah, totally. I think it looks good for some people, but I come back to that basics. If they haven't got the basics right, if you have a cake, if you've no cake, you can't put sprinkles on the top. And I would see some of those elements of what people are doing is they're forgetting about the fundamentals. So if you've get up, go to the gym and not had anything to eat, the building blocks for you to be able to maximize the work that you're doing in the gym is limited. So, what we would try and do is educate that athlete to look at, when did you eat last night? So you might have had your dinner around about 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, you've had nothing to eat all night, you've slept over the course of the night, you get up at 6 or 7, go to the gym for an hour, and then you may or may not have something until 10, 11 the next day. Well, that's well over 12, 13 hours where nothing has gone into the system. They've put in a training block and they've expected to see results from that, and they're probably not getting as good as results as they could have if they even had put, something even as simple as milk, milkshake, something like that in front of.
But you'll see a reduction in either muscle growth or development or performance if people aren't.
Yeah, because it's like building a wall. Your building blocks is your gym or your training, and you need this cement in between, and that's where your fuel comes from. That's the food and nutrition that you eat and consume.
And what about on the far side? What about recovery? How important is it subsequent to exercise?
Really important, because what you're trying to do is think about that session that you've just done. And again, some athletes will just consider protein as an element there, and that's really important. But if that session was a running session or a bike session or whatever, the fuel that they've used is actually carbohydrates. So you want to put that back in, and you also want a bit of protein in there because the two of them work really well together. But they have to think about, when are they going to do the next session? So again, it's making sure that they have a concept of periods of time as well as just seeing it as a session on their own, putting it all together.
And what about the level of attention that has to be given to things like weight? I remember talking to an athlete who told me that he and the entire team he played on were DEXA scanned on a regular basis, so they could see exactly what the percentage body fat was, and if you were over, you were highlighted in red to the entire team.
I'm not sure that that's a positive thing. I think it kind of it plays into, you know, I think we are living in a very kind of image conscious world, which that's the negative, and the I suppose that's the way people go to try and achieve that weight loss in a really bad way. I think personally, I think it's useful from a monitoring point of view. We would use it probably from a health monitoring point of view. We're particularly interested in things like bone health as well, certainly with, say, some of our female athletes or weight category sports, where we want to make sure that these athletes are not only healthy now, but when they hang up their goggles or their oars or whatever, that they have a, you know, that they're healthy down the line, but they also have a really good relationship with food as well. And I think sometimes the message is, if you want to achieve changes in body composition, you eat less, when in fact actually food isn't the enemy. It's, you know, it can be used in a really positive way to enhance your training and competition.
We've talked a bit about the Olympics, and of course the Olympics this year being in Tokyo. The implications for some of the athletes will be, how do you keep the same pattern of nutrition and diet? And on a smaller scale, even you see people who are very into sport or athleticism going on holidays and thinking, well, how will I find the gym or the same set of foods? So what do you do for athletes when they travel? Because that's very tricky to keep an even pattern.
So travel is a really big part of this. We've sent over a container full of dried goods that left Dublin, I think, on the 31st of March. So hopefully it's not going via the Suez Canal. But anyway, it's on its way somewhere between here and Tokyo.
When you say dry goods, what sort of stuff?
So we have things like porridge oats in there. We would have, you know, rice. Well, no, we haven't rice actually, because we're going to the home of rice. But we've got rice cakes, we've got tea bags, we've got, you know, things that we can make at home from home, really. We've got lots of other cereals in there. We've probably got, you know, we've got some maybe wee treats where, you know, again, athletes will like to see some of the things that they would have at home. So there's a whole load of different things that's gone on that container, where we can have Weetabix or porridge oats. You know, porridge wouldn't be something that would come naturally to the Japanese. It's not part of their culture. We've got things like custard powder going out. We'll make custard and have things like that for dessert. So yeah, there's lots of things.
And how much of that is to do with, if you take something like the custard powder case in point, how much of that is to do with happiness and the sense of home, and how much of it is that provides a certain amount of calories and calcium, get it into?
It's a bit of both.
Is it?
So yeah, so again, you know, your cup of tea with Barry's tea bags or whatever it is, and you know, your maybe digestive biscuit, sitting watching TV or looking at the opening ceremony, that's great. If you know, and again, it's a holistic approach to things. But I think actually we'll have things like flatbreads going out as well, and things like this would be some of the stuff that we would recommend to athletes going traveling. Easy to pack, you know, you can eat things like this, some of these ready cooked quinoa, rice, those types of things. They can mix it up, and then they can buy things like maybe some cold meats or deli or cheese when they're there, and they can add to the food that they would get out there. And these things are really easy to pack. They travel with their oats easy, because for me, something like that with like oats, maybe your yogurt, your milk, maybe banana, they'll have blenders with them. So we'll have some blenders as well. And what you have then is really a ready-made meal, which can be used around, you know, training and competition, and gives you lots of the things that you want.
You mentioned blenders. One of the things that a lot of people who are dedicated sports people will do is add a whey protein powder or whey powder or a protein powder or a supplement or anything like that. What's your view on that kind of supplementation for elite athletes and for non-elite sportsmen?
I suppose there is a time and a place for, and again, if you have an athlete who has a very high requirement for calories and then all the other nutrients step up as well, it can provide an easy option for them to take with them. It's easily portable, etc. But, you know, whey protein is the separation of whey and casein from milk when you're making cheese. So if you drink milk, you're going to get a little bit of that as well, or if you have yogurt, you'll have an element too. But sometimes it's very tricky to carry that with you. So I suppose for some athletes, it provides a simple solution in a very portable way. I think the really important thing for athletes, both elite and your weekend warrior, is don't over, what's the word I'm looking for? don't over focus on whey at the expense of something else. So for example, if I spoke to a young Gaelic footballer yesterday, 18 or 19, and his focus really was on whey. He's still developing. For me, part of his development will be his bone health. When he takes whey, that's all he gets is the protein. Whereas if he was to mix that with something else like milk or yogurt, well, he's going to get more protein, more whey, but also calcium, which is really important. So again, it's about the context of what you're actually advising.
One of the things with sports is it lends itself slightly towards faddishness.
Yeah.
So do you remember the things over the bridge of the nose to keep the airways open? There was cupping with the...
Yeah, it's still there.
Is it still there? Right.
Yeah.
Does the same happen with foods? Because you hear about, oh, well, they're all eating X, or they're all... Does that faddishness happen? And B, is there any underlying consistent realities to superfoods that all athletes should always eat?
Yes, it does happen. So again, I think some athletes, athletes are general public, so they're going to be as pliable to information that's coming out across the board. And I think you have to remember is if they think that there's going to be a benefit in it for them, they will try it. There's no doubt about that. Or they will, and I suppose that's my role, is to come in and either argue the point that will work for them, or actually agree and say, okay, well, we'll work with that, but you have to remember that A, B, and C has to be addressed as well. Because sometimes I think no isn't the right answer. That's the reality. So I think that's important. I think the superfoods element is an interesting one. I think it's a marketing term for companies to be able to sell, whatever it is. We have lots of superfoods here on this table that people might not think them as super, but there's beetroot, for example. High in nitrates, which has been shown to reduce the consumption of oxygen and allow athletes to work better at endurance. Was identified with populations with high blood pressure. So again, it comes in general Joe Public. So again, it's part of the reason why that message of fruit and veg is really important. So it's not just as easy as taking it in a pill or a potion. We have bits of the food that's really important, that doesn't give us a vitamin or a mineral. It's going to contribute to things like probiotics as well. If we look at pineapple, a really good source of bromelain, which is an anti-inflammatory. So again, useful in terms of, reducing inflammation post-exercise as well. But I wouldn't see that as just doing, oh, I'll use that because that's high in nitrates, or I'll use that. I'd like to think that by putting them all together, there's lots of benefits. It helps with the recovery, it gets your fruit and veg, it ticks lots of boxes. So it's like that story where you're not just dealing with a carbohydrate. Let's kind of, if I've got a boxer who can only consume X amount of calories every day, I could say you could have 4 chocolate bars and why would I worry about anything else? But from the point of view of the overall big picture, it's not going to hit anywhere near the amount of things that we need to do. Now
that we're talking about things that are on the table, there's one of those things of spot the odd one out. What is the pizza doing here?
Oh yeah, so again, like people would say, right, okay, that doesn't look particularly nutritious. Again, we come back to that athlete who is really stuck for time. They are not going to start making, a base from first principles. That would be lovely, and maybe at weekends or, when you retire, you'll have lots of time to do that, which is great. But if you take a very basic margherita pizza, relatively cheap, but you add, some peppers to it, a little bit extra cheese, maybe some cooked meat or fish or something that you have in the fridge. You can use up your extras or what you've left over. I would add some salad leaves or rocket to that, and suddenly you've got something that's really nutritious. Takes about 5 minutes to cook, and actually, okay, it's not cooking from first principles, but you know what? You've done something there that is mostly your own work, but there's a little bit of help in there. So there are things that I think can be taken that would be seen as maybe convenience or processed, but it's how you look at that and how you adapt it to make it something that's actually much better.
You mentioned the weekend warrior. For the weekend warrior, for the Ironman competitor, for the avid walker, for the hiker, for anybody who knows I'm not going to get shipped out to the Olympics anytime soon, but I'm into sports and fitness. Give us the distillation of the principles from the elite that they should take for themselves from this discussion.
I think fuel your sport. Don't be reading information on something and it's completely inappropriate for the type of work that you're doing. So if you're out on a bike for 4 or 5 hours on a Saturday or a Sunday, think about the concept of that with your car. You know, if you've got up and you haven't had very much to eat and you think you're going to go 5 hours without, you wouldn't do that if you were driving from here to Cork or from Belfast to Cork or whatever. You would actually have fuel in the tank, and again, because you'll get more out of that training session. And I think again it comes back to that message that calories are dangerous. We have to keep them under control, but actually by fueling what you're trying to do, you can actually do that training session much better. And it's that training session that will look after your weight. If that's what you're trying to look after, you'll actually find that you'll have a much better training session. And the next day you won't feel as if you've been dragged through some kind of a, salt course and you're wrecked.
Sharon, thank you very much.
Not at all, thank you.